Maverick Physical Therapy Transformational Zone TZ1 A of the right foot and ankle for our base path running and single leg hopping, if you will. So we're going to sneak on up here, and so that we have a good look at the foot right here in terms of what it does. We're going to alleviate ourselves of the misnomer of the heel to toe functionability and landing that occurs with ambulation, as it does not. And so, and particularly in this instance with regards to running all out around the bases, no matter what that is, if it's rounding out a single at first, we're running out a double, triple, even running a home run. We are, however, in terms of directional changes with getting caught up in a rundown or stopping and going back to a base, there certainly is a unique element with regards to some of our heel to forefoot, midfoot contact, etc. But right now we're talking about running around the bases. So biomechanics of running around the bases, we talked briefly in the intro how we've got this angulation down and to the right trajectory that evolves when we start kind of making our loops, which is in terms of what we're doing running the bases. Again, we're never running in a straight line, even when there is involvement of running straight through first base to run a ball out. The mechanics that we're going to talk about hold true, but the trajectory at which we're set is not going to be the same because we're not making our loop. But we have, with regards to foot and ankle chain reaction biomechanical sequencing, the forefoot, the midfoot, and the rear foot. It's important to understand what is what. So at the tarsal-metatarsal junction of where the cuboids, the medial, middle, and lateral cuboid meet right here, we have the metatarsals and the phalanges. The metatarsals and the phalanges, these guys, so from here on distally lies the forefoot, the midfoot. We've got the little section wedged between what we call the mid-tarsal joint and the tarsal-metatarsal. We've got the medial, the middle, and then the lateral cuneiform. And then we also have I'll turn it over, the navicular bone, and then the cuboid. That's the midfoot. The mid-tarsal joint, on more proximally, lies what we call the talus, which the tibia sits on, and then the calcaneus sits inferior to that on the bottom. Torque converter of the body, we call it. That is the rear foot, these two bones right here. All important rear foot that has the mid-tarsal joint, junction of the rear and the midfoot, subtalar joint, and then also the talocurl, the ankle joint right here, where the mortise is, so the tibiofemoral joint. So unique thing about the biomechanical sequencing of our running mechanics is that the lateral aspect of the forefoot right here is what's going to be coming in contact with the ground anyways. For walking, we walk and we land heel to toe. This is the way that God designed us to land in terms of the outside lateral edge of the calcaneus, so that could set off a chain reaction of loading the subtalar joint, loading the mid-tarsal joint, and the ankle joint, so that we could get the right forms of three-dimensional rotation at the tibia, the femur, and then the hip joint to load the posterior lateral hip joint capsule, aka also the gluteal complex, to be our big power source of stability, strength, and control. So we land, when we're running, on the lateral aspect of the forefoot here. And so it's with that load, and with us being in, based on the angulation of the terrain that we're in here, we're going to be in an inverted position inverted position. However, we're going to be getting eversion. So land on the lateral aspect of the right forefoot, which starts to, in this inverted position, we start to go through the motion of eversion. So the forefoot starts to rotate towards the ground. As it does that, at the tarsal metatarsal joint right here, so yank this leg around a little bit, so we're landing on the outside of the foot. Forefoot starts to rotate in the frontal plane towards the midline of the body. We also start to get dorsiflexion, so we get this motion here and relative abduction. And so it's at this point in this instance at the tarsal metatarsal joint right here that we get relative eversion, we get dorsiflexion and abduction. But as it's going through this three-dimensional motion, the midfoot catches up to it and passes it. They're all going through the motion of eversion, but in terms of getting relative joint motion, they can't all be moving like a 2x4 at once, otherwise we won't get any joint motion, and we're therefore going to be what we've talked about before, pathological condition of tearing up a knee, a foot and an ankle, the labrum of the hip, leading to hammy and groin pathologies. So the midfoot here is going to be everting as well. So even though it's in an inverted position, this angulated position down and to the right, we're still getting the motion of eversion right here. So we get the motion of eversion, and it's at this instance when it starts to pass up the forefoot, the motion that we get at the tarsal metatarsal joint right here actually changes. So we shift and move from relative eversion to relative inversion. We continue to load in the transverse plane with the relative abduction, and we get further dorsiflexion right here. We're really loading up the dorsiflexion so that when we can become more congruent with these joints, as we'll talk about, we've got something very good and solid to be able to push off from after neuromuscular we've gathered from our proprioceptive feedback. It's at this time at the mid-tarsal joint that the midfoot is rotating in the frontal and the transverse planes faster than the rear foot, that with this relative eversion, we get, for an instant there, we get relative eversion at the mid-tarsal joint, and we get dorsiflexion, so the talonavicular joint, it's a ball and socket joint right here. We're getting dorsiflexion, relative abduction with the gapping, and then also relative eversion. This is going to change as then the talus shoots down and in, so it plantar flexes. This guy right here in the rear foot shoots down and in. And as it shoots down and as it plantar flexes, we get further dorsiflexion, we get more relative abduction and gapping. And it's at this point that as the talus shoots down and in, it's going to grab the calcaneus and the subtalar joint, will then kind of evert and give us relative abduction and dorsiflexion that allows then the rear foot to pass the midfoot, giving us relative inversion, abduction, and dorsiflexion at the mid-tarsal joint, and again the relative abduction, eversion, and dorsiflexion at the subtalar joint right here. So the heel doesn't have to come in contact with the ground, and if you were to actually take a look at on the base pass, the footprint of the individual, there's a very good possibility that you're not going to even see a heel print involved in depending on the speed and the trajectory of the individual. And so it's at this point that we're then able to load that subtalar joint three-dimensionally, so eccentrically in all three planes. We're able then to get a good nice splay of the mortise, so the ankle joint right here, the tibiofemoral joint, will open up and splay as we get this anterior slide and glide, this anterior medial slide and glide that goes with the talus shooting down and in, and the calcaneus right here everting. And even though it's rotating towards the midline of the body, the talus is moving faster, so we get a relative, what we call abduction. We almost get this motion right there of the two. But that unlocking of the foot and the ankle complex right there to shape and contour to the surface and the change in level of the environment and the terrain allows us to then enable the tibia to translate anteriorly, to rotate internally, which then allows the femur to internally rotate, as well as the pelvis, giving us internal rotation, adduction, and flexion at the iliofemoral or the hip joint right here. So it's important that we, with our assessments, we take a look at the foot and the ankle complex, the right foot and the ankle complex, that we look at the maw stability, the dynamic stability, and the stability elements in the frontal, transverse, and sagittal planes, so that we can make some corrective recommendations for closing the gap on our genetic potential. Foot and the ankle, when we look at the frontal plane motion, so this motion right here, frontal plane motion of the rear foot, the midfoot, and the forefoot in TZ1 transformational zone 1 in and with running mechanics, forefoot to midfoot to rear foot load and motion. We're then going to, in TZ2, we're going to transition back and away, but that frontal plane motion, we're going to then look at up in the transverse plane, hip stability, strength, and mobility. We're then going to look at the transverse plane motion, our AB and adduction, so right here, our relative abduction, and our ability to decelerate with hip adduction. Frontal plane motion up at the hip, and as those kind of sequence on up together. So we see a variety of compensation patterns throughout the body and the foot and the ankle complex. We also understand that the complexity of human nature to compensate is unique, and that the ability to tear up a hip labrum, the groin, hip flexors, hammy issues, throw the quads on in there, our calf strain and Achilles tendon pathological conditions is a result of a lot of chronic compensation. So again, we'll look at, as a big element, fast stability. We oftentimes look at foot and the ankle and the hip and things not moving at all and automatically assume that it's a mobility related issue, and it's just not. So if we don't have the stability, the neuromuscular element of motor control, motor learning, neuromuscular efficiency, and structural efficiency, the body's going to say, hey, I want a suction cup to the ground, I don't want you to move. So it's important for us to run just a good three-dimensional assessment and to be able to take a look at foot and ankle biomechanics, first and foremost, to know what we're doing and to know and to understand foot and ankle biomechanics. So we're in this angulated inverted position, which we'll remain in based on the trajectory of the body. We're still going to be getting the motion from forefoot to midfoot to rear foot of eversion as each one pass each other up at some point in time in this inverted